recognises that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Enfield North, who remembers another genocide that took place in the world. It's fair to say that anti-Semitism is nothing new. We only have to look back at Shakespeare to look at anti-Semitism was rife during that period of time in our history. It's been prevalent in societies across the world for centuries, and it's still prevalent today, as I recalled about the attack on shopkeepers in Stamford Hill only yesterday. What makes the Holocaust different, however, it shows the ultimate destination of anti-Semitism with a systematic attempt to wipe out the Jewish race and anyone of Jewish religion. Not just people who are openly Jewish, but anyone who had Judaism in their genealogy. And I speak as someone who has that position and would not be here today if I'd been alive in Germany in those times. It demonstrates the way in which people's backgrounds were traced to see whether any relative or any person of Jewish blood was present. So it was systematic, deliberate and intentional. I was at school with many Jewish children and no one spoke about the Holocaust. Half of my class were Jewish. No one ever spoke about the Holocaust during those days. It was ignored, perhaps to be airbrushed from history forever, because it was such a tragedy. The relatives, fathers and mothers, who many of my friends had actually come from Eastern Europe as refugees, but they never spoke about the Holocaust either. When we were at school, we never got the opportunity to learn about the horrors of the Holocaust and what people actually went through at that time. Now, I remember my first ever visit to Yad Vashem. It's not the Yad Vashem we see today. It was the much smaller formation of it, much more intimate in its early days, and that goes back to 1992. That was an epiphany moment for me on my first visit to Israel, seeing Jerusalem, seeing Yad Vashem, and seeing what had gone on during the Holocaust at first hand. It had the first ever recordings of survivors, people who'd sadly passed away but had recorded their testimony in advance, plus early photographs and other details of what had gone on in Germany and indeed Eastern Europe in particular during the Holocaust. Now that made Yad Vashem more intimate in many ways than it is now. It's a much bigger operation with much more testimony and evidence of what happened. But when I heard the names of the children that had been murdered by the Nazis being recited, one name after another, it brought home to me, how could people do such systematic murder of children, wipe them off the face of the planet, and yet what a terrible experience it was. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. I've had the privilege of visiting Yad Vashem on about 4 or 5 times now, and I can remember on one particular occasion going into that cave that he describes where the recordings just continue with children's names and their ages. And by coincidence, there was a run of names of 2 boys and a girl, the same ages as my 2 boys and my daughter were at that time. And I broke down in tears because that's where it really hits home that this could be you. There but for the grace of God go we all. And if politics turns nasty and turns against you, this is the end result. And that's why Yad Vashem and all Holocaust memorials are so important.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. And I freely admit, I'm not ashamed to say, I cried. I cried for humanity, I cried for the people that have been lost, and I cried for our whole being, as to how we could ever have allowed such a thing to have happened. I declare my interest as co-chairman of the all-party parliamentary group for the Holocaust Memorial Centre and Education Centre. I look forward to that centre being built so we can have our own facility where we can commemorate the lives of those that were lost and commemorate those that survived. Now, when I was first elected to this House in 2010, the first all-party group I joined was that on combating anti-Semitism. It's the right thing that we in the House, across the House, on all sides of the political divide, stand against it. Now, I've visited Auschwitz-Birkenau, and I believe I share the view of most students that have seen Auschwitz for only one day. Actually, it would be better if you could stay for a little longer, just to appreciate even further the terrible crimes that were committed. The problem with that is, of course, funding, and the fact that lengthening the amount of time spent away might potentially reduce the numbers who could go on such visits. The problem I see with the programme of Auschwitz-Birkenau visits is that students learn about what went on there and think that was it. But we need to remember that it wasn't just Auschwitz-Birkenau. There was a network of death camps, forced labour camps right across Eastern Europe and Germany, where Jews and others were forced into slave labour and then systematically exterminated. I've often wondered how a civilised nation like Germany could get into a position and commit such inhumane acts. And when we talk about 6 million Jews being killed, it's a number. And it's hard to personalise that down to individual circumstances. It's hard to visualise the horror of this attempt to wipe out the Jewish race. We should remember as well, this doesn't just take place on 1 or 2 years. This was a deliberate long-term attempt by the Nazis to eliminate the Jewish race. And we should remember as well, the roots of this were at the end of the Great War. Germany was subjected to severe reparations. That led to incredible poverty in Germany. It then gave rise to the Nazis, who could say, it's the Jews' fault you haven't got any money. Let's take it out on the Jews. If we take Jews out of the position, we can spread the wealth. It was a deliberate policy of the Nazi Party to spread this hatred, and it should never ever be allowed to be repeated. There needs to be a greater understanding and appreciation that from the early 1930s onwards, the systematic approach led to the Shoah. We have to remember that. We must also remember that anti-Semitism was rife in this country at that time. And we should not think that it wasn't going on elsewhere either. The thought process and the demeaning of Jewish people was going on. And it's one reason why few people were allowed to escape from Germany and come here. Had they been allowed to do so, many people who lost their lives in those camps would have survived. I would like to take the opportunity once again to pay tribute to Karen Pollock and her brilliant team at the Holocaust Educational Trust. They do such wonderful work to educate people, young and old, about the horrors of the Holocaust. No, not everyone can go to Auschwitz-Birkenau and witness the crimes that took place. We talk, and other members have talked about the shoes, the spectacles and the clothing at Auschwitz-Birkenau. But the memory I have, above all else, is walking across the park with the lakes. There's an eerie silence. There's no wildlife, no birds tweet, no animals cry. And the reason why, the wildlife know. That's where the Nazis emptied the ashes from the crematorium. The wildlife knows what goes on there, or what happened there, and so should we. One aspect of the Holocaust Educational Trust's work that has become more important is the outreach programme. Last year, more than 600 schools partnered with the Trust to enhance educational provision. This is important because it allows the Holocaust survivors to give their first-hand testimony, lead workshops, and ensure that young people understand what happened and learn lessons. Now, one of the most famous survivors was Gina Turgle. She lived in Stanmore in my constituency, and in many ways she was a pioneer of Holocaust education. She was going to schools and colleges way before any of the current structures were set up. She was born in Krakow, had eight brothers and sisters. She was only 16 when her home city was bombed on the 1st of September 1939. Now, part of Gina's story that I think is most pertinent, her family had relatives in Chicago. They planned to leave for the United States. But they made their decision too late, as the Nazis had already invaded and closed all the entry and exit points. So her family had to move to just outside Krakow. In autumn 1941, she moved into the ghetto, and then moved after some of her family was shot by the SS in the ghetto. She was forced into a labour camp, and in 1945 to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where she was sent with her mother on the death march from Auschwitz, leaving behind her sister, who they never saw again. They then arrived in a further labour camp, were forced onto trucks and travelled under terrible conditions to Bergen-Belsen, where they arrived in February 1945. And on the 15th of April 1945, the British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen, and among the liberators was Norman Turgle, who became Gina's husband. Gina passed away in 2018, but her record is entitled, of course, in a book she called I Light a Candle, so her legacy lives on. Now, Hermann Hertzberger was born in 1926 in Germany. He lived with his mother, father, and an older brother. He attended a local non-Jewish school. But of course, he was forced when the Nazis said that Jewish children couldn't go to school anymore, that they couldn't go. He was beaten up, going from home to school and backwards again, by people who were his friends when he was in school, because the Nazis had said that Jews were not allowed to exist. Then in 9 p.m. on the 9th of November 1938, the synagogues were burnt, and businesses and homes and shops were smashed. Windows were smashed and homes and buildings burnt to the ground. That is the night of Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. Now, after that, Hermann's parents realised they had to escape. They couldn't escape. They weren't allowed to. But he was one of the first to come on kinder transport to this country, where he built his family. He never saw his parents ever again. But they had a long journey to get to the UK. They were taken to a hostel in Margate, remained there for about a year, where Hermann had his bar mitzvah. They regularly wrote to their parents, and 2 days after war broke out, their parents wrote to them to say they'd received their permits. They were going to be allowed to leave. But once war broke out, they weren't allowed to leave, sent to a camp in the Pyrenees, and eventually murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau. But in this country, Hermann and his brother were separated and then reunited. Hermann went on to marry and live in my constituency. He regularly spoke to schools about his life and what had happened to Jewish people when they came as refugees to this country, which, by the way, was not a happy experience for those people. We should own up to that and honour that memory. So we, of course, honour his memory because sadly Hermann died on the 1st of January 2020. I had the privilege of meeting him on many occasions and had the opportunity to hear of his experiences both in this country and before he arrived. Now, the reality is, of course, as time goes on, the survivors are sadly no longer with us. So it's very important that we capture their testimony on video, or on audio, and every other aspect, and in writing. I've had the unfortunate opportunity of seeing the plight of the Rohingya at first hand, to see what happens still in this world. So we've got a duty to ensure that those people who've perpetrated murder are brought to justice, suffer for the war crimes they've committed, and that we help and assist people who are refugees. I'd like to end, Madam Deputy Speaker, by saying that the theme of this year is one day. We put aside all our differences to remember what happened, not only in the Holocaust, in Nazi persecution, the genocides that have followed, as have been mentioned. We hope that one day in the future that there will no longer be any genocide. We learn about the past, we empathise with others today, but we must take action for a better future. And I'd like to end by quoting Ibi Kanel, survivor of the Holocaust, who said about the camps, "You don't think about yesterday, and tomorrow may not happen. It was only today you had to cope with, and you got through it as best you could."